Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this very special presentation of No Higher Service, Franklin County, Maine's Fallen Soldiers of World War I. Before I begin with my prepared remarks, I would kindly ask everyone if you would pull out your phones and silence them, given the solemn nature of this presentation. I think you're going to find that it is a very heartfelt presentation and work by Mr. Glenn Miller. I am Drew Goodridge, and I am a member of the American Legion Roderick Crosby Post in Farmington. We are just down the street at 158 High Street. And I am deeply thankful for the Farmington Historical Society for hosting today's presentation. And what you are about to witness culminates from a project initiated by the Mount Blue Area Garden Club with their restoration and beautification efforts centered on the Teague WWI Memorial Arch in Farmington. This war monument was a gift bequeathed to Franklin County by John M. Teague, a Civil War veteran who, like many at that time, was shocked by the atrocities of the Great War, World War I, also known as the War to End All Wars. Roderick Crosby, Post 28, was invited as a collaborator and stakeholder in the restoration efforts and has taken a pivotal role in planning for the Arch's 100th anniversary, which will happen on Memorial Day next year, 2024. Post 28 Legionnaires participated in the original dedication in 1924 and successive observances thereafter. In 2024, we plan a grander observance in honor of the 100th anniversary. The Farmington Historical Society, in conjunction with other Franklin County historical societies, is working to collect artifacts to place in a time capsule, which has been donated by Wallace Remembrance Centers. Post 28 is organizing a chicken barbecue in hopes to raise money to send local students to Darrigo State, formerly known as Boys State, which is so they can experience a comprehensive experiential learning youth leadership program centered on how our American government works. We are inviting public and elected officials to attend the observance. In addition to living relatives of the fallen soldiers, you will learn about this afternoon. For nearly a year, Post 28 has hosted anniversary planning committee meetings to bring together ideas for a memorable public observance. And I encourage those with interest in learning more to visit our Post website or speak to me after this presentation. Our next planning meeting is tentatively scheduled for Saturday, January 6th of this next coming year at 10 a.m. at the Legion Hall for those who can attend. And we will be moving at a blistering pace to finalize the program. And so my call of action for you is I need leads on securing a professional sound system so that we can have that at the Arch to help amplify our presenters. I also would like information regarding any living relatives of the Grand Army of the Republic, J.F. Appleton, Post 25, here in Farmington. I'm looking for any artifacts or anything like that that may add value to our presentation. And leads to contact local Civil War reenactors, as well as leads on relatives of members of any Franklin County chapter of the Veterans of World War I of the USA Incorporated, which was a congressionally chartered organization which is now dissolved and administered by the Department of Affairs. So I'm hoping that there are relatives out there who may have artifacts from that particular organization. And so with that, now I am pleased to introduce to you Glenn Miller, our presenter. Glenn is a retired entrepreneur, professional writer, and editor, as well as an amateur historian and genealogist. He moved here from Colorado with his wife, Rachel McClellan. The two of them have embraced Maine and the town of Farmington as their home. Discovering and telling the stories of Franklin County's World War I fallen soldiers has become an important and ongoing project for him. And so now I yield the stage to Mr. Glenn Miller.
Thank you. Thanks to the Historical Society for presenting this program, giving me access to records that bring these men's story to life. Thank you to the American Legion for leading on this project. Thank you to the Garden Society, Mount Blue Garden Society, for taking care of this monument for so long, keeping the memory of these men alive. And I'd just like to continue that tradition. There will be an intermission. in about 45 minutes. So if you need to leave at that point, I understand that. We're here to connect the present to the past through the stories and families of these fallen soldiers. And if one of these men is part of your family, your great uncle or your great great uncle, or with Mr. Bruce Johnson here today, your uncle, then please talk with me so we can add your family lore and your family imagery to this ongoing story. I haven't met all of the people here who are veterans or who might be related to these men, but if I could ask for anyone here who is a veteran, or if you're related to one of the men that in your lore was part of this history, could you just put your hand in the air just for a moment? Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for letting us share your family's memory. This is for you. Europe, 1917. Across the Atlantic, World War I has been raging for 3 years, resulting in a bloody stalemate. Neither side has advanced more than a few miles, and at costs of millions of lives. Armies on all sides are exhausted. But the Germans have reason for hope. On their eastern flank, the Russian army has quit the war. The Bolshevik Revolution has upended politics and the balance of power. The Germans can now reroute half their army to break the impasse on the West. America, 1917. President Woodrow Wilson, after provocations that finally demanded military response, has declared for war. Though he was reelected to keep us out of the conflict, within a month of his term, he has plunged us headlong into it. At the time, the United States fields the 16th largest army in the world. And to imagine victory with forces that small is audacious. But so is our country. Franklin County, 1917. Across the country, towns are teeming with enthusiasm. The colors have been called, and America, the new Colossus, bristling with patriotism and pride, answers. Its young men shoulder past each other to enlist, to fight the Huns, to go over there. To fanfare, they assemble in main streets everywhere, racing to be the first to give Jerry what for. Yankees, bright-eyed, confident, irrepressible. They collected in Rumford, in Livermore Falls, in Waterville, in Norway, Skowhegan, and Farmington. Doughboys at the ready. These were the early enlistees, full of fervor and optimism. Draftees would follow, 2 million of them. Over the next 18 months, enlisted or inducted, men bound for fighting boarded trains to cheers and waves and bands playing. Millions served. Most returned. Yet for some, it would be that last time they saw home, the last wave from a loved one, the last kiss from a young bride, the last celebration of innocence. 116,000 American soldiers died in World War I. 1,026 of those were from Maine. 33 of those were from Franklin County. But those are just numbers. These few souls were more than that. They were our sons and brothers and husbands. As boys, they were called to war. As men, they fought for country. For those who paid the highest sacrifice, for those Franklin County soldiers who died in service, we owe a special debt. The first part of repaying it is to recognize to whom the debt is owed and to remember those 33 men and their 33 stories. Starting with this one. Frank Fuller Weymouth of Kingfield. He was called in Franklin County's first draft and was the first casualty. In late summer of 1917, the Army established Camp Devens in Massachusetts as a temporary training center. It was scrubland, 35 miles west of Boston, a convenient rail hub. 28-year-old Frank arrived the next month for training. He never left. Camp Devens was thrown together between June and September at a rate of more than 10 barracks a day. It was built to accommodate an entire infantry division, and its peak population during World War I exceeded 35,000. But those close quarters would prove deadly. Not all enemies wore uniforms, and Frank's assailants were microscopic. With immunization still 50 years in the future, Army Private Weymouth contracted and succumbed to measles during basic training. Instead of boarding a troop ship across the ocean or returning to his life as a farmer, Frank Fuller Weymouth came home under a flag to be buried in Sunnyside Cemetery in Kingfield. George Malin Sedgley of Stratton. The phrase fog of war expresses the uncertainty that combatants experience on the battlefield, where details are obscured. Just the same, the fog of history can forever hide the details of those lost to time. That fog of history clouds what can be known about George Sedgley, leaving but this: he never married. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Ira and Augusta Sedgley. George enlisted just after the draft was announced and served faithfully, earning his 2 corporal stripes. Yet despite his patriotism, this young soldier never made it to France. On the 13th of March in 1918, while American forces overseas were still training under the war-weary French forces, George succumbed to the plague that had infested international and domestic soil. He was Franklin County's 2nd war casualty. Earl Linwood Ackley of Farmington. He enlisted in the Army on his 22nd birthday in the middle of December 1917. With others from Troop B of the 15th Cavalry, Earl sailed east for the French coast out of Hoboken. After occasional choppy seas with soldiers chiding those who fell prey to seasickness, they landed at Brest on March 14th. In this war, the USA had lost more personnel to disease than to combat. Influenza and pneumonia most virulent among them. 2 weeks after arriving in Europe, 2 weeks as a member of the American Expeditionary Forces, 2 weeks on foreign and deadly soil, Private Ackley was overcome by disease, the first Franklin County casualty in the European theater. His ensuing voyage west over the Atlantic reversed his earlier route, this time Brest to Hoboken, this time below decks in parallel rows of flag-covered boxes, side by side with other war losses. This time, not caring about choppy seas. Charles Wilbur Foote of Wilton. Inches, they called him, playing on his surname. Company K was amiable like that. How could they not be? They were boys. Well before the draft, Charles had enlisted with other Franklin County boys into the 2nd Maine Regiment of the National Guard, a reservist unit. In 1916, he deployed to Mexico. He was a good soldier. He trained hard with the other boys. In 1917, as part of overseas mobilization, the U.S. Army drafted National Guard units to active combat. Company K of Maine's 2nd became Company K of the Army's 103rd Infantry Regiment. In Franklin County, Company K mustered out of Farmington, drawing its leadership from Farmington, Wilton, Industry, and Strong. Units were local because lifelong neighbors and friends could summon more spirit and resilience defending each other than they could for strangers. But of these 250 Company K neighbors and friends, 4 would not return. The first American division to arrive in France was the 26th, nicknamed the Yankee Division for being 28,000 New Englanders. Among its numbers was the 103rd Infantry. Within that, Farmington's Company K. Within that, PFC Charles Foote, veteran. His 103rd Infantry Regiment went into the front lines in February of 1918 and would stay for 210 hellish days, where, north of Toul, Lorraine, and Boc, farm towns had become war zones, turned ugly and lifeless. Mud and bullets, trenches and gas, barbed wire and rain and bodies and concussive hellfire soon left only men, not boys, in Company K. The prolonged ordeal for the 103rd would last 7 months. Fighting man Charles Inches Foote survived for 2. He fell in a raid on the Toul sector. The first death recorded from Company K. Not the last. Daniel Bailey Gould of New Vineyard. Daniel was the tallest soldier in the U.S. Army, standing 6 feet 7 inches. The boy giant, as the local paper deemed him, died at only 19. He had tried to enlist in 1916 for the Mexican border mission, but was too young and could not sway his father to approve the decision. On the day the war was declared, his 18th birthday, he was working on his father's farm in New Vineyard. When he heard the news, Daniel dropped his hoe and walked the 8 miles to Farmington to enlist. Before the war, his strength and size made him a star guard on the Farmington High School football team, a giant on the field. Dan Gould was in the Yankee Division and part of the 103rd Infantry, an American vanguard on the Western Front. 3 years in the making, that 400-mile corridor of trenches was filled with millions of weapons and men, new and used. His unit occupied a line shooting distance of the dug-in Boche, a slur the French used for Germans, roughly dog. On the 10th of May, those dogs launched a major barrage of heavy explosives and poison gas, all while Corporal Gould was on patrol, a giant on the field. A bullet wounded him. 2 friends carried him 1.5 miles to the field hospital. There he died. Rose, Daniel's mother, would soon receive a letter from Albert Andrews, captain of the 103rd, describing Corporal Gould's battlefield conduct. He has proved himself a good soldier, willing to do his duty at all times. You may well be proud that you had a son who did not flinch when the time came to make the supreme sacrifice in this great struggle. The second casualty from Company K. William Lawrence Rounds. Character would have been excellent on discharge, read the CO's report, but this was a formality. Marine Private Rounds was never discharged. In the Battle of Belleau Woods, where he fell, his 6th Regiment Marines, outnumbered and poorly supported by the French forces, almost single-handedly prevented the German army from capturing Paris in the heavy fighting of June 1918. The French military awards the Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War. William Rounds earned that distinction for his acts of bravery in action at Belleau Woods. To this day, the Marines revere the battle there, remembering the 1,811 U.S. forces lost in those firefights. William Round's remains were first honored with burial in the woods of Bois de Belleau at Hill 181 on the Beau Maps number 49, northeast of Lucy-la-Bocage. 3 years later, those remains came home to eternal rest on the steamship Wheaton for final burial in Strong Village Cemetery. Stanley Leon Buck of New Vineyard. Sergeant Buck had spent 3 years active in the National Guard, even patrolling the Mexican border in 1916 after Pancho Villa's New Mexico raid that killed 8 Americans. Before attaining his sergeant's chevrons, he was affectionately called Buck Private, transposing his name and rank in jest. His mother Mabel's only son, Stanley wrote home on occasion to allay her fears. From one letter, he said, "Do not worry, and someday, when I get home, I will tell you all about my foreign trip." But he never did. Halfway between Paris and Stuttgart on the Western Front lay Chivray et Marvoissin, defended by 200 men from Buck's 103rd Infantry. There, on June 16, 1918, some 600 Germans attacked the town, first with heavy artillery, then with infantry assaults on 3 sides. It was the most severe bombardment against U.S. troops so far in the war, at great cost, including 28 lives, the 103rd held. Sergeant Buck was among those who died on that field. Amid the chaos, shell fire found him. He's buried there in the Saint Michel American Cemetery, Company K's 3rd casualty. After the war, his mother Mabel wrote this poem to his memory. "I loved you enough to give you up, yet it followed after, this love of mine, like a convoy ship across the sea to keep you safe on the battle line. Like the trusty rifle in your hand to go with you through no man's land. For love never faileth led, you know, and I loved you enough to let you go." Ralph Shafton Hosmer of Wilton. In youth, Ralph was sickly. Rheumatic fever made him withdraw from Wilton Academy. It kept him from graduating. It left him weak. So he made the best of a small town life. He stayed home and worked the family farm. He became a loyal member of the Grange and an actor in local plays. Ralph Hosmer was always jolly, full of life and fun, the ideal of a well-loved local boy. Then came war. The oldest sibling, Ralph's patriotism drove him to enlist, but he was underweight, they said. "Come back when you are stronger." Now with purpose, Hosmer put on pounds. He came back stronger. In the Army, Ralph quickly rose in ranks. PFC, then corporal, all before shipping to France on the Lapland out of New York City. Months of fighting followed his arrival, as his 103rd saw heavy action in En-Marne and Champagne-Marne, spearheading the Yankee division. Despite his size and medical history, the ideal local boy became the ideal soldier, accomplished in the heady throes of combat, a fierce frontline warrior. But in late summer, a letter from his friend Arthur Sprague brought tragic news to Wilton. "There has been some very hard fighting going on here, and my outfit was in it. You remember little Ralph Hosmer well? He was killed, and a number of others. I cannot tell you how many. I tell you, the 26th Division has done some hard fighting, and a lot of it." On the 20th of May, at the Second Battle of the Marne, a machine gun bullet felled Corporal Hosmer, the last to die from Company K. Matthew K. Mishral of Rangeley. His death came on the 20th of July, the most tragic day of the war for Franklin County's families, as 4 of its young men would fall. The 103rd Infantry, still the tip of the fighting spear, led the vanguard of the Marne River, where Allies saw that stopping the Germans here could sway the war, even though the price be dire. 12,000 soldiers paid with their lives. There were 120,000 more French, British, and Italian casualties. The numbers belie comprehension. German losses were even higher, 160,000 men. Matthew Mishral enlisted at age 20 with his brother William and 2 friends. Another younger brother was later drafted. The other 4 eventually made it home. And Matthew would survive warfare overseas for 10 months himself, until this, the Second Battle of the Marne, and the bloodshed of July 20. This was the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Allied forces had, as planned, lured the enemy into overextending, but at immeasurable cost, including trading a German rifle bullet for the life of Private Matthew Mishral. This battle, these sacrifices, ended a string of German victories and enabled the start of the 100 days offensive that would, in 3 months, end the war. Carl Gunnar Thomas of Chesterville. A blue-eyed farmer in the small town of Chesterville, Gunnar had immigrated there with his Swedish family when he was 14. On arrival, they changed their surname from Thomas to Thomas, better to blend in. He dropped his first name, Carl. Young Gunnar made fast friends. Among them, Oscar Nichols, 4 years younger. A year before the draft, when he was 24, now 10 years a U.S. citizen, Gunnar Thomas enlisted into Company C of the 2nd Maine Infantry of the National Guard, whose troops were being called to the Mexican border. It was 1916 and the start of a promising military career, as in short order, Thomas would advance to corporal, sergeant, first sergeant, a model officer. 2 years later, in Chesterville's Union Church, with the war still 3 months from over, but with casualties mounting, including Thomas, that model officer lay under a flag. His family shared a memorial service with the family of Gunnar's friend Oscar Nichols, alongside whom the first sergeant had shared a military career. They had died together on July 20 in the Second Battle of the Marne. The two were young men of fine character and pleasing personality. Read the newspaper account, but that was well known, for in Chesterville, everyone attending knew and loved both servicemen. At the memorial, under greenery, flowers, and the national colors, their pictures stood side by side, as the men had in Mexico and in France. The heartless war across the ocean continued its relentless campaign of grief and loss, having carved a star-shaped hole into the heart of the small farming town of Chesterville, Maine. Oscar R. Nichols of Chesterville. A year before the draft, 19-year-old Oscar Nichols enlisted 2 days after Gunnar Thomas, his Swedish friend, from their hometown of Chesterville. Population, 600. It was 1916. Oscar and Gunnar were determined to serve together. In Company C of the 2nd Maine Infantry, they served at the Mexican border together. When a year later, that unit was drafted into federal service as Company C of the 103rd Infantry, they trained together. In September of 1917, on the ship Celtic, they sailed to France together. For months overseas, they battled together. The next summer, in the Second Battle of the Marne, Corporal Nichols and Sergeant Thomas, now hardened veterans were fighting together. It was the 20th of July. That day, while standing firm in defense of country and honor, these men of Company C were strafed with horrific machine gun fire. That day, they died together. It would be weeks before their families could know of the grim new statistic. Chesterville, population 598. Ralph Guy White of Farmington. At 34, he was the oldest serviceman to die from Franklin County. At the Abbott School for Boys, Mr. White was a beloved teacher of English and Latin, a position he had trained for at Grove City College in Pennsylvania and at Harvard Law School. But as much as he loved his tenure and his students, he loved his country more. A week after America declared war, instructor Ralph White volunteered to serve. He was not new to military discipline. In Pennsylvania's National Guard, White had risen to full command of the college battalion with the rank of major. Now a National Guard lieutenant, he spent the early summer of 1917 recruiting the 2nd Maine Regiment to full war strength, finally going overseas himself in September, but not before first making a special detour. Ralph grew up in Pennsylvania, and so had one Sarah Hart Ross, a school supervisor who in this summer of 1917 was living in Spokane, Washington. Ralph boarded a train south to where they grew up. Sarah boarded a train east. In late August, in Pennsylvania, in uniform, Ralph White, 33, married Miss Sarah Ross, 42. The next month, newlywed Ralph crossed the Atlantic. His bride never saw him again. Sarah Ross White's life would be long and full, though she never remarried and never had children. She died in 1961, 86 years old. Lieutenant Ralph White's life would be truncated by war. The next summer, in France, a call went out for line officers for a major offensive. Lieutenant White had spent much of his time in the combat theater coordinating logistics and communications for advanced headquarters. Invaluable tasks, but not where Ralph's heart lay. Given the chance, 2nd Lieutenant White asked to fight. His opportunity was at the Chateau Thierry sector on the Soissons front, not far from where the Second Battle of the Marne took the lives of 4 other Franklin County soldiers. As part of a surprise offensive, his 23rd Infantry Regiment force marched through the night and at 5:35 on the morning of the 18th of July, went over the top. A brother officer saw Lieutenant White standing with his platoon in a hail of bullets. He described the scene. Ralph was joking with his handful of men. We had time for just a few words and parted with a, "Best luck, old man." I never saw him again. This Battle of Soissons succeeded in cutting German supply lines, permanently impairing their armies and forcing retreat. For the remainder of the conflict, the Germans would be on the defensive. The war had turned, but the price of that success included the life of Lieutenant Ralph White, who fell to machine gun fire in the little town of Verzy, in a blood-soaked battlefield on the barren, moonscape wastelands of northeast France. Percy L. Jordan of J. After high school, a few months working in a garage was enough for Percy Jordan. Good people were dying overseas. Friends were beginning to enlist. A draft was rumored. One thing young Percy, beloved hometown boy, knew for sure: he was a patriot. And patriots speak with their actions. After enlisting, he trained at North Carolina's Camp Greene with the 1st Army Headquarters. 11 months later, he was promoted to corporal. When spring broke in 1918, Corporal Jordan boarded the Antigone out of Hoboken. 2 weeks of sailing put him in France, and by horse and by train, his unit reached the front. Fighting there was heavy and ugly. Adjacent French forces were exhausted. Fresh American fighters were untested, but not Corporal Jordan with more than a year in uniform. Yet, within a month, on these battlefields of eastern France, Jordan was demoted to private. There must be more to tell about this, but the record does not speak to it. Combat raged on. American forces had not yet arrived en masse to make decisive difference like the kind that would come at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. But here, 2 months after his demotion, Private Jordan was on guard duty one July day at 5 a.m. There was a fatal accident with his rifle. That's all the record shows. There must be more, but the record does not speak to it. After the war ended, the U.S. endeavored to repatriate the remains of every serviceman buried overseas, if their families wished. Of 74,000 questionnaires sent, 44,000 asked for this tribute. Percy Jordan's family was among them. For the next 3 years, crews were to locate, exhume, and identify fallen warriors. It was grisly work. At the cemetery near Tours, hundreds of graves had been individually numbered. Percy Jordan in plot 207. 2 years after he had died, with care and with reverence, diggers emptied grave 207, where they knew he lay. It was empty. There was confusion. How could that happen? The record does not speak to it. Eventually, they found his body, and 3 weeks later, he was listed as a passenger on the transport ship Sherman, returning to Hoboken for reburial in Arlington, in Virginia. But his casket was sent to Montana instead. An inexcusable disservice. There must be more to tell, but the record does not speak to it. His summary of indignities and accidents were grave, and without reasons we can know, but for whatever we cannot know, we can know this. Percy Jordan, resting now eternally in Arlington National Cemetery, where he belongs, was a beloved patriot whose family paid a higher cost than any family should be asked. And that's all the record needs to show. Fred Linwood Johnson of Strong. On his 16th birthday, Fred Johnson enlisted in the National Guard in Company K of the 2nd Maine. By 18, he was an old vet, a 3-stripe sergeant. In Mexico, when his unit was sent for border guard duty following the Pancho Villa uprising, he was a leader of men, despite his age. Once in France, he did the same. In the spring and summer of 1918, his 32nd Division relieved war-weary French troops at the German border, smashing through trenches that had held the enemy line for 4 years. Nicknamed Red Arrow for these raids, his unit went on to conduct combat patrols into Germany itself. They were the first U.S. troops to set foot on enemy soil in World War I. But these continuing battles at the Marne would have their toll of blood. While advancing with his company at Saint-Gilles, young Sergeant Johnson was stricken by an enemy bullet and fell on the battlefield. 12 years later, his mother would stand on that hallowed ground. Florice Johnson was one of more than 6,000 women who accepted sponsorship as a Gold Star mother to visit the countryside where their sons and husbands had died. Her expenses paid by a grateful nation, Florice's 2-week pilgrimage in 1930 included sightseeing stays in Paris, along with the cemetery visits. By this time, Sergeant Johnson had been reinterred from a gravesite at the mayor's house in Saint-Gilles to Voisin, the second largest American cemetery in France. Florice was guided past 6,000 other crosses to her son's name, carved in marble, and given a wreath to lay for tribute. What more pride and heartbreak can there be but to stand at the grave of a lost child? She was 69. Lester Howard Wills of North J. 2725566. His serial number, assigned on the 20th of May in 1918 in Farmington, where his recruiting officer lined him up with 72 others in response to a presidential call for more men. More men. Lester lived in J, where he farmed his own land. He was summoned to the county seat with those more men, all assigned sequential serial numbers. 6 of those Franklin County men would not come home alive. 40 days later, departing from Montreal in the city of Puna ship, Wills shipped to France, along with others who had trained with him at Fort Devens. Private Wills' service to country ended first among his group of more men, from pneumonia in France. First among those men from common backgrounds, on a common mission, serving in common, dying in common. Following his uncommon valor, this soldier's family had his body returned to Maine 2 years later to full military honors. 7 servicemen fired 3 volleys. His 2 parents oversaw the burial. 1 bugler sounded taps.
Glenn's words have humanized these soldiers, some of who, like Lieutenant Thaddeus Roderick, who we will soon learn about, may be known only by their name on a grave marker, an archived war document, or an American Legion post. The ending of the Great War truly was the beginning of the American Legion. After the signing of the armistice in November 1918, American service members waited in France for transatlantic transport back home. There was no Department of Veteran Affairs ready to receive them. There was no GI Bill available to pay for their education. There was only a $50 stipend and a train ticket to the closest station to their home. While in France awaiting transport, a group of soldiers banded together to lay the foundation of the American Legion, which evolved into one of the most influential nonprofit groups in the United States. Membership swiftly grew to over 1 million members, and local posts sprang up across the country. Today, membership stands at nearly 2 million in more than 13,000 posts worldwide. The American Legion played an integral role in the creation and modernization of the VA, the passing of the GI Bill into law, and most recently, the passing of the Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics Act, known as the PACT Act, which expands VA healthcare and benefits for veterans exposed to burn pits and other toxic substances. Farmington's Post 28 was chartered in July 1919 and has been an integral part of the community for 104 years. In 1919, the charter members of Post 28 named the post after Lieutenant Thaddeus Roderick, the first Farmington native World War I combat casualty. We all know the Great War was not the war to end all wars. World War II engulfed our nation once again into global conflict. And at that time, our predecessor members voted at the conclusion of World War II to rename our post as Roderick-Crosby Post 28 to honor Corporal George Crosby, who we believe to be the first Farmington World War II combat casualty. We recognize our namesakes with plaques and memorabilia adorning the walls of our beloved post, lest we forget. And this phrase, lest we forget, is used as a caution against forgetting those who died in war. And Glenn Miller's work, No Higher Service, is a written testament to those who made the ultimate sacrifice to their nation in the Great War. And these soldiers, these men, these warriors will never be forgotten.
Thaddeus Lewis Roderick of Farmington. He wanted to be a teacher. He trained for it in high school and at the Farmington State Normal School, the precursor to UMF. A normal school trained teachers. Thaddeus was at home there. He belonged. But as his graduation grew near, tension overseas weighed on him. Roderick confided in Principal Mallett, his teacher at the normal school. Mallett would later recount, "He was gentle and affectionate and a lover of peace. As the days went by, I saw a serious look growing on his laughing face. He came to me to talk of war and duty, our country's needs and his own tastes. He spoke of his ambition to become a teacher, but his country was calling. His friends were enlisting. He too must go." Going would mean leaving his high school sweetheart, Dorothy McKean. Going would mean leaving family and friends, his school, and the community where he belonged. But go he did. In May of 1917, to join the machine gun company of the 2nd Maine Regiment at Bangor. A month later, Thaddeus Roderick returned to Farmington for what would be the last time, for 2 ceremonies. In the evening, he graduated from Farmington Normal School in uniform, the first person ever to do so. And that morning, in an earlier family ceremony, he had exchanged vows with Miss McKean. She graduated alongside him as Mrs. Roderick. He returned to his unit on the same day. He belonged with his men. In September, Corporal Roderick shipped overseas the same day as the others from the 103rd Infantry, Foote, Gould, Buck, Hosmer, Mishrill, Nichols, and Thomas. The motto of the 103rd would come to be, "To the last man." Of these 8 soldiers, Roderick would be that person. In France, Corporal Roderick became Sergeant Roderick and then Second Lieutenant Roderick, a natural leader and a model officer. In time, the U.S. Army had prepared to launch its first major offensive. Saint-Michel was the target, a German incursion the enemy had held for years, one the French had been unable to overtake. On the 12th of September in 1918, heavy, driving wind followed 5 days of rain. Men were knee-deep in mud, yet hundreds of thousands of American and French fighting forces assaulted the German fortifications. Roderick led his platoon and worked his machine gun. On the 3rd and final day of the battle, Allied forces prevailed by encircling those Germans who had failed to retreat, capturing 16,000 POWs. In the melee, Lieutenant Roderick was mortally wounded by shell fire. He was buried on a hillside near there. News traveled slowly during the war's final tumultuous days, in October the next month, his brother Hector, also serving in France, wrote home to their brother Fred, "I have not heard from Thaddeus in about a month. I guess his mail has gone astray." The body of Thaddeus Roderick lay under French care near Saint Michel for 4 years. In 1919, Farmington's American Legion Post Number 28 chose Lieutenant Roderick as its namesake. 3 years later, at his widow's request, the body of the dead hero returned to his hometown, to a memorial service at that American Legion post. Every student from his high school attended, as did most of the town, where all businesses were closed. The American Legion and National Guard marched his body to Riverside Cemetery. There were last rites, a rifle salute, and taps. Thaddeus Roderick taught his comrades in arms the value of loyalty and belonging. He taught his family the value of commitment to an ideal. He taught his community and the Legion Post who honored him the value of sacrifice. Thaddeus Roderick wanted to be a teacher. To his everlasting memory, he was. Chester Emery Fletcher of Wilton. Tall and slender Chet grew up in Wilton, but at 21, he went west. Maybe mining would be his career. In his hometown, he had tried farming, plumbing, and lumbering, but the possibilities with the Eagle Pitcher Lead Company in Oklahoma drew him across the frontier. Yet when the draft was announced, he came home. His draft number was called the same time his cousin Ralph's was, so on a brilliant summer Tuesday, the 25th of June at 2 p.m., he was best man at the wedding of Ralph Gould and Helen Clifford. 3 hours later, the two men reported for duty. The next morning, to fans and fanfare, they and 72 other recruits boarded the train for Camp Devens. In Massachusetts, Camp Devens was less than 200 miles away, not even a day's travel. So when his first furlough was granted 3 months into his training, happy to spend time with his family, once again, Private Fletcher came home. His older brother Walter traveled up from Boston. His younger brother Gerald was still in Wilton Academy. Chet spent a week with them and his parents at home. During the war, families, or sometimes churches, schools, or towns, for the first time displayed service flags, a white fielded banner with a red border and one blue star for each service member. Should the soldier die, then a gold star was sewn atop the blue. Blue symbolized hope and pride. Gold represented sacrifice. Their combination evoked grief. Back at Camp Devens, 2 weeks after his furlough, Private Fletcher fell ill during drills. 35,000 encamped men carried 35,000 chances for infection, and Chester was stricken. Despite the best medical care, he died within a week. In Wilton, the Methodist Church added the second gold gilt star to its service flag, while in Camp Devens, Chet's company, with exquisite care, draped the U.S. flag on his casket. Thus, arrayed and in eternal repose, and for the last time, Chester Fletcher came home. Harold Isaiah Parlin of Weld. In the bright summer of 1917, 23-year-old Harold signed his draft registration card, farmer, no dependents, no wife. His name in the queue, he returned to his land. For another year, he tilled the soil and tended crops while friends and neighbors were called to war. For another year, he watched the newspaper and his mailbox, until finally, in the heat of August 1918, with America shipping 100,000 men per month overseas, Harold got the notice. "You are called for military service," the letter read. His time had come, but Harold would not make it across the ocean. Mustering out of Farmington, he stepped off the train in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where Camp Colt was the first post to train soldiers in a new type of rolling, armored behemoth. In charge of training this tank corps as his first command was Captain Dwight David Eisenhower. But the battlefield consecrated by Lincoln was no defense against the virus that spread wherever armies massed, and the 11,000 at Camp Colt were massing in force. Before he could fight in the new armored division, Private Harold Parlin fought and lost against the invisible scourge ravaging the globe. Leroy Augustus Horn of Weld. Leroy turned to dowels at the Bedell Sweet Company in his hometown of Weld. His father made spools. His bride-to-be was a teacher, 4 years his elder. In the summer of 1917, the draft compelled his registration. So 5 days later, Leroy and Georgia filed their intent to marry, and within a month, the wedded couple began what would be but 1 year together. The following summer, with relatives cheering and Wheeler's band playing, he and 59 other recruits boarded the train for Camp Devens, Massachusetts, close enough for Georgia to visit. But 2 weeks after the last time she saw him there, on the 1st of October in 1918, Leroy Augustus Horn died of pneumonia, the third Camp Devens casualty from Franklin County. Leroy was a husband, tall and slender, a soldier well-loved and well-trained, and a victim felled by a ravaging pandemic that vied with the war to steal the most lives. How grand the injustice, how cruel the cosmic trade to take the full measure of a man and leave for history but a grieving widow and a pitted stone. Frank Faithful DuBoard Jr. of J. 2725538. One ship from Montreal carried to France a cohort of men from Maine, serial numbers almost adjacent. Among them was the soldier-born Francois Fidel DuBoard Jr. He was a papermaker, not a soldier. But in the Mouzargon offensive, the largest operation of the AEF in World War I, he was more than even that. He was a hero. Frank, the American of French-Canadian descent, chose to serve the colors with his life. German forces were massed at the hills of Exarmont, 400 yards away. After 2 days of heavy shelling by the Americans, his superiors needed a report on the enemy. Frank volunteered. Though it meant crossing the bullet-strafed no-man's land between hostile trenches. Amid vicious fire, Private DuBoard traversed and scouted the enemy placements. Suffering his way back for the mission had cost him wounds that would mean his death. Yet he returned to report what would be the last things he saw. For his service, Private DuBoard received a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross for heroism. In the melee that followed, his body was never recovered. Months later, back in Maine, in lieu of the son who would never return, his parents, Frank Sr. and Marie, accepted the cloth and bronze pin on his behalf. Sanford Albert Landry of Rangeley. 2725554. Sanford was 59 years younger than his father Martin. The youngest of 6, he was the last of his siblings to live with their father, who was 82 when his son was drafted. The French-Canadian Sanford labored at a mill when his name was called to be one of more men needed on May 28th in the last year of the war. With 72 others that day, including 5 who would not come home, he boarded a train to Camp Devens. Weeks later, Private Landry departed from Montreal in the City of Puna ship alongside Lester Wills and Frank DeBoard. Sanford Landry was sent where the fighting was heaviest and most decisive, at Saint-Mihiel and Mouzargon, the battlefields where America's forces were breaking the will of the Germans. His unit was operating north of Frank DeBoard's fatal scouting at Exarmont when Landry was killed in action. A cross of marble in the rolling grasslands of France is all that marks his passing. Let us add one more thing. Let us add memory. Moses Arsenault of Phillips. 2725550. He was born on Prince Edward Island in 1891 and came to America at the age of 22 with his brother and cousin. 4 years later, when Moses was working as a woodsman, his namesake grandfather immigrated to be with him. But the next month, Moses was drafted. His draft card read, medium height, medium build, brown eyes, brown hair, this face in a crowd of faces. One more anonymous alien in America sent to fight in France. The town of Phillips gave 55 men to the World War. 28 served overseas. The one given a Silver Star for gallantry in action, did not come back. Army Private Arsenault was killed in action on October 6, 1918, 5 kilometers from Frank DeBoard and Sanford Landry, and 5 weeks before armistice with Germany ended the war. His body was never recovered. In respect, and no longer anonymous, the name of Moses Arsenault was memorialized forever on the tablets of the missing at Mouzargon American Cemetery. Everett Elmer Hinckley of Rangeley. Everett's 1918 summer unfolded with tragedy. His mother died after a year battling diabetes. Everett never knew his father, who died before the boy could speak. Along with his stepbrothers, he grew up and lived on and farmed his stepfather's land. But his farmer days were numbered. A week after his mother died, he was compelled to register for the draft, and after 3 weeks more, the tall, blue-eyed soldier was on a train out of Farmington to Camp Devens. His second assignment took young Private Hinckley to Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Subsequent years would vilify Edgewood for testing its chemical weapons on volunteer soldiers, but that was decades to come. In 1918, Edgewood was the largest poison gas factory on Earth, and still a secret. When first put into production, it was staffed with civilians. But despite higher and higher pay, the work of making phosgene was so dangerous that the plant could not remain staffed. Their spots were filled with soldier recruits who had orders to follow. Make noxious gas, chill shells to avoid combustion, fill with poison, add TNT to the cap, screw on the shell, apply paint to identify the type of death within. Then stack and store, ready to equip with a battlefield fuse. Any soldier tasked to make mustard gas would say he'd rather be fighting than work among the acid and fumes of a chlorine plant. But for Private Hinckley, the deadly agents were not mustard, chlorine, or phosgene, or even man-made. They were viral and just as lethal. Complications from Spanish flu killed Private Hinckley a month shy of war's end. Fred A. Delbert Burnham of Wilton. Red hair sits under Burnham's cap, a farm laborer until he was drafted into the Yankee Division. Like 28,000 others from the 6 New England states, he took pride in the reputation of the 26th Infantry, the first National Guard unit to go overseas and the first to fight there. But like too many others in units committed to frontline warfare, his story is inescapable clockwork. Inducted in May, trained in June, sailed in July, fought in August, cited in September, died in October. Private Burnham earned a citation star for gallantry in action, personal valor in direct combat with enemy forces. His came at Saint-Mihiel, the first American-led offensive in World War I, the same battle where Lieutenant Thaddeus Roderick fell. His calendar of valor concluded when Fred Burnham was killed in action on October 12th of 1918. It was 29 days to armistice. Rex Lee Tobin of Wilton. On the 2nd of June in 1917, 3 days after turning 21, this mill hand, working at the Wilton Woolen Company, married 16-year-old Lillian Norlin. 3 days after that, Rex registered for the draft. For 11 months, the young newlyweds made a life for themselves as best they could in tenuous times. They would not have children. Finally, after months of waiting, a letter came. You are hereby notified. Rex was inducted in May. In New York and Alabama, he was trained in shooting, gas warfare, and to use the bayonet. After 6 weeks, he shipped out of Hoboken, sailing toward the deadliest military campaign in American history. In another 6 weeks, Private Tobin saw and heard and felt that fighting himself. His 116th Infantry spearheaded an attack in the Mouzargon Forest, a crucial battle in the 100 Days Offensive that would end the war. Casualties were heavy. Yet through all his service, Rex sent letters home. In June, his mother Ada got a letter. So did his wife, Lillian. Imagine how dear the words and ink. In July, they got his letters. In August, his letters. September, letters. Then came October. No letters. Week followed week. No letters. Finally, after 6 weeks of waiting, a boy came, too young to be a postman. He and others his age across the country were recruited to be the grim couriers of heartbreaking news. The boy carried a telegram. Deeply regret to inform you. The Mouzargon was not only a critical battlefield, it was also an unsanitary landscape of filth and disease where contracting a worldwide contagion carried as much risk as combat. 9 days after his last letter had informed Lillian that he was well and happy, serviceman Rex Tobin died of pneumonia less than a month before Armistice Day. James Auclair Boyle of Rangeley. James Boyle knew tragedy. When he was 8, With younger brothers 5 and 4, his mother died of tuberculosis, a racking respiratory disease whose wasting effects he was forced to witness. His Scottish father, a salesman, was bereft. An infant daughter had died earlier, and now his American wife succumbed to consumption's coughing, gasping agony, and his children needed care. The best he could do was to send them for boarding on a farm where they could attend school, do chores, and grow up under the watchful eye of the farm's matron. Thus, James Boyle, future soldier, grew up as a working boarder, his 2 younger brothers alongside. By August of 1918, the draft didn't care about such circumstances of anyone's upbringing. By then, the Selective Service was so desperate for bodies that it loosened the size requirement to this. Then, our nation demanded that men as short as 5 feet and as light as 100 pounds put on its uniform. But James Boyle was none of these. By then, he was tall, fit, married, and 21, a chauffeur, and because of his skills and intellect, fit for innovative American training. Private Boyle was sent to the Wentworth Institute for Combat Engineers in Boston. As part of the 101st Regiment, he trained on demolitions, camouflage, machine gun emplacement, excavation, auto mechanics, road building, weaponry, and every other invention that could, by clockwork or cleverness, win the war. But for all their innovation, these combat engineers had no defense against the fast-moving, fatal pneumonia that followed influenza around the globe. A camp doctor wrote to a colleague describing the dreadful onset. They very rapidly developed the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones. And a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over their face until it is hard to distinguish the colored man from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then, until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. What a cruel, cruel fate that Private Boyle's life ended as his mother's had, gasping for air while doctors stood helpless. Donald William Norton of Kingfield, the first man to enlist from Kingfield. Donald Norton trained for science and he trained for combat. An exemplary student at Orono studying chemical engineering, he left for officer training when the war was declared. Though decorated as a scholar, he completed his training as an officer. At Camp Devon, 2nd Lieutenant Norton served as adjutant, eager for his overseas orders. They came the next July. He sailed on the Aquitania. At every opportunity, Donald volunteered to serve. He volunteered to lead. He volunteered to fight. And in a letter home 3 days before his fatal battle, he wrote that he regarded himself as one of the fortunate ones to be chosen for the front. That front would be the Muzargan Offensive, one of the attacks that brought an end to the war and the largest operation of the AEF, comprising more than 1 million American soldiers. It was also the deadliest campaign in American history. Lieutenant Norton was among its 26,000 dead. Months later, in advance of Norton's memorial service, his regiment captain wrote to Donald's parents with details and closure. My dear Mrs. Norton, Lieutenant Norton was killed instantly, I believe, in advance on November 1st. As far as I can learn, a piece of shell struck him in the back of his head. As you may suppose, he was in exactly the spot where his duty called him to be, giving his best to a great cause. That was the advance that broke the last stand of the Germans and brought peace. Neil Greenleaf Vaughn of Strong. Neil tried to enlist when the war started, but never being of robust constitution, he was rejected for physical reasons. So he continued to work the family farm. Then his mother died, and young Neil's responsibilities suddenly included caring for his 70-year-old father. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, horrific battles raged, depleting troop counts, demanding more men. The boy unfit for service was drafted on October 24th. But an enemy that killed more U.S. soldiers than warfare was rampant worldwide, not just in France. Recruit Neil Vaughn was sent to Fort Williams in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, to train on the heavy guns of the Coast Artillery Corps. Waiting for him was one of the deadliest pandemics in history. When he took ill, his sister and her husband were able to join him at camp, witness to the heroic efforts made to save him, and of their ultimate futility. Neil was drafted, sent to training, contracted the flu, and died of pneumonia, all within 2 weeks. 5 days to armistice. Wilmer White Hanscom of Carthage. 2725534. Like the others from the cohort of more men drafted on May 28, Private Hanscom sailed from Montreal a month after mustering in Farmington, with his Camp Devens training behind him. In France, he fought with honor for months in the most brutal conflicts. A machine gunner in the 28th Division, Hanscom fought in the turning point battles at Saint-Mihiel and in Mouzargon. But wars have victims on both sides, and the Germans too had bullets and shells. Had the combatants known it was only 4 days to armistice, it might have been different. Instead, Wilmer's dark blue eyes closed forever in the last battle fought in France. 3 years later, his body was returned to Dixfield with full military honors. Although this was the last of Franklin County's combat deaths, the war's pitiless toll would claim 4 more local servicemen. Ralph Jacobs of Rangeley. A devoted son and patriot, Ralph Jacobs served his first 3 years in the Army as a signalman for the Coastal Artillery. Enlisting before the war had even begun, Jacobs chose the military life for its discipline and rigor. Stationed in Panama's Canal Zone, Ralph sent his meager earnings home to his widowed mother. He sent postcards as well, and in early 1917, with service overseas unavailable, he mustered out as a corporal. Character excellent, read the CO's report. He returned to New England as a reservist, into a kind of hospital work that gave him purpose. 2 months later, the U.S. joined the war, and the soldier's response was immediate. He sought combat, even accepting assignment as a private to do so. Ralph had trained on heavy guns and joined an artillery battery active on the front line, serving with honor for the war's duration. But fate is cruel, and munitions are dangerous. A month after armistice, in the midst of demobilization, Private Jacobs died in France of an accidental rifle wound. It would be 2 years before the steamship Wheaton would carry his body back. Ralph Jacobs was reinterred in home soil under full military honors. Lee Harlow Woodcock of Carabasset. He was a farmer from a farming family. Armistice would come at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. At that time, on that day, fighting would officially stop. But that was still 13 days in the future when draftee Woodcock was declared fit for service, entering the Army the same day as recruit Neil Vaughn. Woodcock was sent to Fort Williams, like recruit Vaughn, to train for the Coast Artillery Corps. But it wasn't until a month after Armistice Day, a month after fighting had stopped, a month when forces overseas and on domestic soil were suddenly and chaotically demobilizing to return home, that Private Woodcock contracted influenza. 100 miles from home and 30 days since peace. Lee Woodcock died 2 days after Christmas. Ivan Curtis McAllister of Rangeley Plantation. 2725546. This red-haired son turned dowels at the C.B. Cummings and Sons Mill in Bemis, where his father was superintendent when Ivan was drafted. Like the others in his more men cohort assembled in Farmington on the 28th of May, Private McAllister trained at Camp Devens and set sail from Montreal a month later. But he never made it to France. After 3 days sailing on the St. Lawrence, he debarked his cruise ship in Nova Scotia. Instead of crossing the ocean, his next several weeks were at Pine Hill Hospital in Halifax. He wrote from there, "Dear Father, I will write you a few lines tonight to let you know I am still in Halifax. They took me off," and he told his tale. That tale would continue with recounting how, instead of joining the convoy of troop ships to France, McAllister was pulled for medical reasons. When he recovered, his post was stateside at the headquarters of Virginia's Camp Stewart, the largest troop handling facility in the U.S. Here he served. For 5 months, he shipped soldiers across the Atlantic, and then for 5 months more, he welcomed them back. But thousands of returning doughboys meant thousands of chances for pneumonia to find Ivan McAllister. After his military funeral in Maine, his obituary extolled the many beautiful floral tributes. Instead of a son, Augustus, Ivan's father, was left with only his grief, an insurance check, and pretty flowers. Allen Robbins Wilbur of Rangeley. For 6 months, America had been done with the war, but the war was not done taking American lives. Franklin County's first draft quota inducted 44 men, 3 of whom died in service. Frank Weymouth, the county's first casualty, was among them. So was the last. From France, serving in his field artillery company, PFC Allen Wilbur sent a letter to his father saying he was well. It read in part, "Hope to be home before many moons." Private Wilbur survived hellish fighting in Saint-Michel, nursing that hope. He endured the entire war, nursing that hope. His homecoming was delayed during the bottlenecks of demobilization, and still Allen nursed that hope. Then pneumonia struck. 2 years later, his remains came home instead. Allen Wilbur is buried in a private family cemetery in Rangeley. The things we asked these men to do run into hailstorms of shellfire, stand under overwhelming assault, outnumbered and outgunned, suffer the worst chemical violence that science could conjure, die for their fellow man, die for us. These commands were beyond reasonable, beyond any civilized ask, yet ask we did. And they answered, every one with their lives, to the last man. We asked everything of them, every single thing. So what shall they ask of us? From a century ago, what shall they ask? It is one thing only, to remember. Thank you for coming. Drew, if you want to come back up here, if we have the opportunity, if you want to ask a little Q&A, if we'd like to. We can also mention that we have next year at the ceremony, on Memorial Day, for example, there's a time capsule we're putting in place. We want to have memories like this preserved another 100 years and not forgotten. Our opportunity here is to make sure that the phrase "lest we forget" has meaning. And I want to also mention that this is an ongoing living project that we're doing here about the stories of these men. That we have a website called nohigherservice.org. If you go there and reach out to the contact page, you'll get me directly, and I'm desperately seeking additional stories, additional pictures, additional histories from your families, so that we can, in an ongoing way, make these stories complete over time. There have been errors, of course there have, because the history is incomplete. Those are my errors, and I want to fix them. And if you can help me do it, it makes this project even better over time. You saw probably around there's a small booklet that contains these stories as they exist today. We'll make a new version of that as we get new stories. Open it up for any questions, any comments, anything we'd like to say, any way we'd like to remember these guys.
The book is going in the time capsule.
I think that'd be delightful.
So please make sure.
Let's put a copy in there. Sure, sure.
Glenn, thank you very much. As I've read and learned about you and your move from Colorado here, I can't help but think how you got so immersed in our little town's history, particularly one that goes back so many years. So how did that happen to you? Don't look at your wife.
Well, but that's the point. How do you know when you fell in love? So of course I looked at her. When we first visited Farmington, we wrote about it on our little travel blog. We said we have a crush on Farmington, Maine, and we wrote about this charming town we found. We showed up on Summerfest 4 years ago. And the town was dressed up in its finest, and it was charming and delightful, and we couldn't stand how brilliant and perfect this little town was for us. And when the opportunity came up 2 years ago for us to buy a house here, we snapped at it. We were living life on the road, we snapped at it, and we took our few possessions and we raced out here. And we're just delighted to be here, and we love this town and the people in it.